Having laid the foundation and explored the epic narratives of Troy, it's now time to turn our attention to the actual archaeological site itself, especially known as Hisarlik, to explore all the evidence for the settlement along with the historical war, the siege, and the eventual destruction in Layer 7. As I mentioned in the last episode, archaeologists have been digging at the site of Hisarlik on the western coast of Turkey since the 19th century. The site itself has been in near constant occupation since the Neolithic period around 3600 BCE. It first peaked around the early Bronze Age too, building monumental walls and architecture, and playing a pivotal role in the early Minoan and Cyclades trade networks between Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and mainland Greece. Following this, it seems to have lost a bit of importance until we reach the late Bronze Age around 1300 BCE, where we observe a major change in the city and it becomes much larger. Notably, during this period, the city consisted of a steep fortified citadel and a sprawling lower town. It was a thriving coastal city with a considerable population, equal probably in size to second-tier Hittite settlements. It had a distinct northwest Anatolian culture and extensive foreign contacts. This late Bronze Age period is usually referred to as Troy 7 in the stratigraphy of the site. While Homer tells us that Troy was destroyed and abandoned after the Greeks won the war, actually this isn't true at all. There is plenty of evidence that Hisarlik was occupied in both the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age well up to the Classical period. The question therefore becomes when or if the Trojan War actually happened. Establishing this chronology has become the focus of excavations at the site. Despite its popularity in the myth and the Greek hero's reputation for hubris, motivated by Kleos and Time, there has currently been no inscriptional evidence recovered from the site that references a war, let alone any definable battle as one described in the Iliad. In the late Bronze Age, we do have evidence for warfare and conflict all across the Aegean, not just at Troy or Hisarlik. Hittite texts, primarily written in Luwian hieroglyphs, frequently discuss issues and cultural conflicts between their own empire and the wider Aegean. A place known as Wiluša in Hittite language is mentioned several times as being somewhere in between the Aegean and the western coast of the Empire of Anatolia, and that both the Aegean cultures and the Hittites are frequently fighting for control of it. It's now largely accepted that the Luwian term Wiluša refers to the site of Hisarlik, and that Homer's name Ilium is a Greek rendering of the native Hittite name Wilusha. This correspondence was first proposed in 1924 by Emile Forer, who also suggested that the Hittite term Ahiawa, a name for the region west of them, corresponds to the Homeric term for the Greeks, Archaean. Forer used linguistic similarities since Wilusha and the associated place name Tauruza shows strong parallels to the Greek names Wilius and Troia, respectively. Subsequent research on Hittite geography has lent these identifications additional support, and they are now generally accepted, although I will say still not firmly established. Since the period itself is about warfare, it's really the big theme of this whole period, that naturally makes looking for a single specific conflict very difficult without inscriptional evidence. If we were to take Homer at his word, archaeologically we may expect to find evidence of destruction that erases an entire settlement at Hisarlik, but actually we don't. In reality, the site of Hisarlik appears to have undergone several different phases of destruction. The first occurred in phase 6H, which is roughly contemporary with the rule of the Walusian king Khunmi, and roughly corresponds to the late Helladic 3A2 period around 1300 BCE. But this destruction seems to have been very short-lived because the city was rebuilt almost immediately afterwards. The builders reused many of the earlier city's surviving structures, mainly its citadel wall, which was renovated with new stone towers and mud-brick breastworks. Numerous small houses were also then added inside the citadel, filling in the old open areas, and the new houses were built in the lower city as well, whose area appears to have been greater in Troy 7a than in Troy 6. In many of these houses, enormous storage jars called pithoi were found buried in the ground, and as far as we can tell, the city of Troy 7a seems to have been built by the survivors of Troy 6's destruction, as evidenced by the continuity in material culture. However, the character of the city appears to have changed drastically, with the citadel growing, crowded, and foreign imports declining. There was then a second destruction at the site around 1180 BCE, roughly contemporary with the Late Bronze Age collapse, but after the destruction of Mycenaean palaces. This destruction layer shows evidence of violence and a siege, mainly in the form of scorch marks on certain buildings. But again, the city was rebuilt shortly after as Troy 7b. Older structures were again reused, including Troy 6's citadel walls. In the first phase, Troy 7b1, it appears largely to be a continuation of Troy 7a. While it may be tempting to assume Achaean aggression for these destruction layers, imported Mycenaean-style pottery attests to some continuing foreign trade. However, the city's population appears to have dropped considerably, and rebuilding seems to have been confined to the citadel rather than the houses in the lower town. Finally, Troy 7b was destroyed again in the mid-11th century BC, probably by an earthquake. A few of the buildings were repaired, but the town was not systematically rebuilt like it was in the earlier periods. Some of the proto-geometric pottery uncovered at the site is paralleled in mainland Greece, especially in and around Euboea, Phorkys, and Macedonia. So it was clearly still part of the Aegean trade network during this time, even after its supposed destruction. Some houses in the citadel were left intact, and the site continued to be occupied, if only by squatters. While this might be the closest style of destruction to that mentioned by Homer, this destruction period is obviously way too late to be the one he's talking about. The 7b siege is post the destruction of the Mycenaean palaces and the Late Bronze Age collapse, meaning characters like Menelaus and Agamemnon can't have been ruling kingdoms during this time because the palaces were gone. Temporally, one could argue that 7a perhaps fits better with the destruction described in Homer's time scales, but this destruction was really small, and the city was rebuilt very quickly, and above that, contact with the Mycenaeans was maintained. They kept trading, they kept communicating, so there was no cut-off of enemies. Part of the challenge with reconstructing Hisarlik as a site is that Schliemann's excavations were not great. They were very poor by modern standards. His initial work with the mound had him ignore certain sections and just dig straight down through the layers, which included removing features that he considered insignificant without studying or documenting them. These layers are now completely lost to us. Since Schliemann only really cared about the Bronze Age Troy, he ignored most of the earlier layers, digging through them and ultimately damaging them. Work from 2014 onwards has, however, shown that the early layers of the site are incredibly complex and detailed. Nowadays, the ethos behind excavation has changed drastically. No longer are we searching for Troy, but we acknowledge Hisarlik's multi-layered occupation and are examining each successive city in its own context and the wider connections that it would have had. While seriation is still used, recent work has begun to make use of radiocarbon dating to differentiate the periods, but it's nevertheless very complex work. So, as we move away from the romanticized version of Troy, what do we actually know about the site of Hisarlik itself, at least historically? Well, Schliemann and a lot of the archaeologists following him confined their study to the inner walls of the city, as these were the only parts of the landscape that Homer actually mentions in the Iliad. However, recent work has made use of ground-penetrating radar and field survey to study the remains of the entire town found outside the walls. This external town is actually much larger than we had originally expected, and it was likely defended by monumental ditches which look absolutely nothing like what Homer tells us about the city. Troy City continued to flourish well into the early Iron Age and beyond, contrary to Homer. We know this because there are extensive amounts of proto-geometric pottery that were unearthed during the field survey work. Occasionally, I've even seen people try to offer rebuttals to this by saying that since the proto-geometric pottery is inherently Greek in origin, its presence at Hisarlik simply indicates Greek travellers or pilgrims who were coming to the site after its destruction and leaving offerings there, probably to perform rituals or remember the war. This would make sense in theory if it were Greek people who were bringing the pottery. So, to test this, in 2001, the Troja project, which involved Pavel Gnila of Freie Universität in Berlin, analysed the ceramics and found that actually many of them were locally made, showing an early Iron Age community was still thriving there. This pattern of archaeology always having to answer rebuttals with historical facts is actually, unfortunately, fairly common with major literary sites such as Troy. Rather than asking their own questions, archaeologists often get pinned down trying to answer questions or doubts posed by people outside of their field, and this has, for the most part, been true of the entire history of Troy's excavations. Part of the resistance brought by Troy as a city is because it's the ideal position in Western culture. Not only is it the subject of the Greeks' core myth, but even the Romans traced their ancestry back to Aeneas, the Trojan prince who went on to father the line that eventually culminated with Romulus and Remus, the founders of Rome itself. Prominent during the Victorian era was the belief that the modern West was the cultural heir to the Greeks and Romans. Even today, modern notions of rationality, colonial superiority, and Western science still trace their roots back to this alleged connection between the wider European West and Greek culture. In other words, how we receive and ultimately interpret Troy has fundamentally been as a Western culture. In fact, it is the origin of Western culture. Notions of our masculinity, notions of whiteness, and heroism also are subtly still present, even in popular media representations. We can't forget, though, that Hisarlik was in Turkey, and its position on the western coast of Anatolia marks it as an essential gateway between the entirety of the East and the Aegean. It was one of, if not the main point of contact in which Eastern culture and practices met and integrated with Greek. A large portion of the Eastern influence that went on to define the archaic period of Greece would have been mediated probably through this site. Huge portions of Greek identity are established here as a cross-cultural exchange between the West and the East. This is the real story of Troy. Archaeologically, it's a site that's been continually occupied since the Neolithic and stands as a great connector between two continents and two very different cultures. By examining Troy from the early to late Bronze Age, we find pivotal insights into how Eastern and Western cultures interacted and really formed each other. As a fundamentally Anatolian site, a lot of Hisarlik's culture is Eastern in nature, from its living style, its architecture, even its religious practice. But this is not the side of Troy that is shown to us in the West. Our reception of it is fundamentally Western, playing on old Victorian ideas and interpretations of Homer. All of these are, of course, ethical and social questions that are still being discussed in modern archaeology, but oftentimes get pushed to the background in the popular discourse. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about it in the comments below. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.